Welcome to MMA at Midnight. I'm your host, Shant Yeretzian, and this is our second episode. Today we're going to talk about the fights coming up on Sunday, UFC Fight Night St. Louis, Jeremy Stephens versus Do Ho Choi. And we're also going to talk about some of the other fights on the card, some MMA news in the world this week, and we're also going to have another segment of Midnights of Our Past where I recommend an old event to watch. Okay, we'll start with the UFC Fight Night in St. Louis. We have a few fights on the undercard we'll start with on the FS1 prelims. Thiago Alves versus Zach Cummings. You know, that'll be an interesting matchup to see where Thiago Alves is this point in his career. You know, he's been still competitive, but don't be surprised if Zach Cummings wins. I know a lot of people might not be as familiar with him as Thiago Alves, since Alves has been in the UFC such a long time and fought for the belt, but don't sleep on Zach Cummings. You got Michael Johnson versus Darren Elkins. This is a very interesting matchup. This is Michael Johnson's first fight at 145. He's coming off two straight losses, one to Khabib and then one to Justin Gaethje in Justin Gaethje's debut, where he was stopped. So it'll be interesting to see what he looks like at 145. Also, Darren Elkins is really tough. He's one of the most underrated fighters in the UFC. Also, this is his 18th fight in the UFC. So he's on a 5-fight win streak, 18th fight. He's a veteran. His first fight in the UFC was against Dwayne Ludwig. So that should tell you how long ago it was. That was like a totally other era of UFC. So don't sleep on him, though. Like I said, he's on that win streak. And I believe if he gets a win over Michael Johnson, he'll be up there in that mix for the title talk. Moving on to the main card, we'll talk about Emil Meek versus Kamaru Usman. This is actually a really interesting fight because these guys both have power, and Kamaru Usman, you know, he had that KO win against Sergio Moraes in his last fight, but he did have a lot of decisions. And Emil Meek is known for stopping guys, so it'll be nice to see what happens in that fight. You know, Emil Meek has wins over Jordan Meehan, and he was known he got into the UFC after his win over Husamar Palhares. So this is going to be a really interesting matchup. You know, I'm sure it'll be fireworks. I'm sure it'll be exciting and competitive. In the next fight, we have Paige Van Zandt versus Jessica Rose Clark. This is an interesting matchup because we have Paige moving up to 125 now that division is open. And we'll see what she does there. She didn't have too much luck at 115. She had a few good wins, but she also had some losses. So we'll see what she does here. Jessica is a tough fight. She's really well-rounded, but she's also durable. She's hard to put away. So I'm kind of curious to see how Paige approaches this fight, if she's going to go for the cardio and, you know, and see if there's any openings. If not, just get the decision. But don't be surprised if Jessica shocks everyone and, you know, gets the win over Paige, whether it's a finish or, you know, by like a TKO or a knockout or even a submission. So keep an eye on that fight. We heard about Jessica. She had a break-in at her house, and, you know, her cat was killed by one of the burglars. Like, please, people, like, it's bad enough, like, stealing and breaking in people's homes. Don't hurt any animals or any living being, any human. Be nice to all living beings. So that's sad. You know, I wish her the best of luck on everything, and we'll see if that affects her mentally in any way. You know, having pets of my own, I know that would be devastating for me. So we'll see how she does on Sunday. Next fight, we have Uriah Hall versus Vitor Belfort. This, of course, is going to be fireworks. You know, Vitor, he always brings it. You know, he might only be around for the first round, but he's going to bring it. And Uriah Hall, you know, we always, with him, it's a mental game. You know, sometimes he just looks amazing. He looks unstoppable, like he's like one of the best fighters in the world. And other times, he just kind of looks like he's having an off night. The way Vitor has been looking in his last couple fights, I have to feel that Uriah is probably going to be really confident in this fight, and he's going to be focused. And he really seems to have gotten over that like hurdle of kind of like that mental game slowing him down. And I really want to see him have that consistency because he is a great fighter. And if you hear him talk lately in his last couple fights, he does seem to be in a better mindset and more confident as knowing that he is that great and talented. Vitor retiring, well, that's a long time coming. We saw Vitor have his win streak, you know, with the TRT era. After that, it was all just downhill. And maybe it's time. Yeah, it's just better if he just retires. Had some amazing fights, amazing knockouts. He's been in some battles. He's fought the best of the best. So it'll be interesting to see how he goes out in this fight. And yeah, that's we'll see what happens with that. But I believe Uriah is going to be able to beat Vitor. Vitor, he's known for gassing, so don't be surprised if Uriah he turns it up after in the second round or third round. In our main event, we have Jeremy Stephens versus Doo Ho Choi. This is a really exciting matchup I'm looking forward to. Doo Ho Choi, he's been amazing. Ever since his first fight in the UFC, I couldn't believe the way he moves, the way he strikes. That fight with Cub Swanson was just a war. Every fight before that, Doo Ho Choi, his opponents in the UFC, he just put them away fast. So it was good to see him in there with Cub Swanson in like a war like that against some adversity. And he did get caught a bunch of times, so that's something to see if Jeremy Stephens can catch him. But Doo Ho Choi's striking is amazing. His timing is amazing. This is going to be a great matchup to see. So everyone tune in for this main event. I can't wait for it. It's going to be action-packed for sure. These guys don't know boring. Jeremy Stephens and Doo Ho Choi don't know the meaning of boring. So it's going to be an exciting fight. You guys are definitely going to want to check that out. Okay, let's see what news we have going on right now. Earlier this week, Bellator announced they signed Big John McCarthy, referee Big John McCarthy, as color commentator. And today they just announced that Jimmy Smith, who left Bellator, is signed with the UFC. So he's going to be doing color commentary and desk work for the UFC, which would be very interesting. Jimmy Smith is one of the best guys in the business. He's very knowledgeable. I've always enjoyed his broadcast on Bellator. He's always improved it. And as far as Big John joining the Bellator, that's awesome. Big John's very knowledgeable. He's a likable guy, but he also he's very professional. He carries himself well the way he talks. So that'll be good to see how he does at the broadcasting booth doing the color commentary. Also today they announced that Chael Sonnen and Rampage Jackson will now be headlining the Bellator card in Lima on January 20th, and Lima and Rory McDonald will be the co-headliner. I'm not sure why, since Lima and McDonald's a great fight and it's for the belt. It's probably, I don't know this for sure, but ticket sales maybe, people see like Chael Sonnen versus Rampage Jackson. It's probably more for the casual fan. All the hardcore fans know it's where it's at with Lima and McDonald, that's an awesome fight. It's probably just to draw in some casuals, get some ticket sales going, because everyone knows Rampage and Chael, so that's probably for that. I'm not too worried about it. I know some people are upset. It's not necessarily the way it should be. The title fight should be the main event, but all the hardcore fans, we all know what the real main event is. That's not going to change. We're still going to see the same fights that night, and they're still going to be, the same caliber. That's not going to change. This segment I like to call Midnights of Our Past. It's where I recommend an old event to watch. Whether you're new to the sport and you haven't seen it, it's kind of like a history lesson, or if you're a longtime fan, it's kind of a nostalgic, go back and watch it. This is UFC. This week I'm going to be covering UFC 84 Ill Will. This was one of the best UFC fight cards of all time. It was one of my favorites. It was top to bottom. It was stacked. It had a lot of great finishes, a lot of great fights, legendary fighters on there. The first fight of the night was Christian Welch versus Shane Carwin. This was a classic knockout. This was Shane Carwin's debut in the UFC. It was the one where he KO'd Christian Welch with that huge punch, and Christian Welch's mouth guard went flying across the cage. It was one of those classic knockouts, one of those moments that you always remember. It was a great knockout, definitely worth watching. The next fight, we had Jason Tan versus Dong Young Kim. Dong Young Kim elbowed Jason Tan probably like 20-30 times. His elbow was covered with blood. Like, I've never seen so much blood on an elbow before. Like, he just kept hitting him over and over again with the elbows. It was brutal. It's definitely worth watching that fight if you haven't seen it before. The next fight was Yoshiyuki Yoshida versus John Copenhaver or War Machine. Yoshida choked out War Machine completely cold. This was awesome. Like, it was such a tight choke. He had that really tight. He got that so super fast too. He got it early in the fight. You also had this is a fan for fans of Pride. You had Sokuju versus Nakamura. This is kind of like an old Pride matchup in the UFC. Sokuju did really well in this fight. You know, he was landing a lot of leg kicks. He landed a big punch that dropped Nakamura and ended up buckling his leg. And he ended up getting an injury and not being able to continue because he pretty much, you know, it was like a flash knockout. He dropped him and his leg folded up under him. That was a really exciting fight as well. Husamar Palhares' debut in the UFC versus Ivan Salivary. Ivan Salivary at the time was known as like one of the best submission guys in the UFC. And then you had like the new breed, Husamar Palhares, just come in and he armbarred him. This armbar, it going back and rewatching it, it's like the mighty whiz bar that Demetrius Johnson got, just without the suplex. It was on the ground. Husamar had his back, you know, he had the hooks in, and it was like the sweetest transition that he did to the armbar, and he caught Ivan Salivary. Ivan Salivary, being such a magician on the ground, he didn't even see that armbar coming. It's super impressive. You know, if you're a fan of the submission game and jiu-jitsu, you should definitely watch that fight or watch it again if you've seen it before. Thiago Silva versus Antonio Mendez. This was a really good fight. Thiago Silva, we always know him as a violent fighter, always going for the quick KO. Mendez, he landed a huge head kick on Thiago Silva, which rocked him. And but Thiago Silva ended up coming back. You know, he's like a cornered dog when you hit him like that. You know, he just lashed out, and he ended up stopping Mendez with some brutal ground and pound. So that was an entertaining fight. Lyoto Machida versus Tito Ortiz. This was a legendary match. If you haven't seen this, definitely check it out. Machida, this was when Tito was having a lot of beef with Dana, and it was his last fight on the contract. People weren't sure if he was going to leave the UFC at the time. And Machida was up and coming. You know, a lot of people didn't know who he was. Kind of thought maybe he was like, you know, he had kind of had that stigma of being elusive, boring, and people he won over a lot of fans with this fight. You know, beating up Tito the way he did. He landed a huge knee to the body, which, you know, folded up Tito onto the ground. Tito had that nice submission triangle armbar attempt at the end. Great fight all the way through, entertaining. After that, one of my favorite fights of all time, Vanderlei Silva versus Keith Jardine. Being a big Vanderlei Silva fan, when seeing him get a huge win like this against Keith Jardine in the UFC was just awesome to see. To this day, like, I celebrate like the way Vanderlei did on top of the cage when I watch it, because it's just such an awesome finish. You know, he swarms them. Vanderlei is definitely the most aggressive guy. When he gets you hurt, he has I think Joe Rogan even says that he has the best killer instinct in the game, like in that fight, in which he does. You know, that's really true. Vanderlei is definitely, if you don't want to get hurt in front of him, because he's definitely going to swarm you. That KO was one of the best KOs ever. I love that KO. In the main event, it was BJ Penn versus Sean Sherk. This was a great matchup. This was when Sean Sherk, you know, was coming back from his suspension. You know, he lost his belt, and BJ was tearing it up at lightweight. You know, this was a great fight. BJ did a lot of trash talking, selling the fight, which that was fine. You know, they made up afterwards, but it made a great lead up to the fight. You know, Sean Sherk had a lot of haters after that steroid test, and BJ being like the loved fighter that he was, you know, it was a great you know, it was a great good guy versus bad guy type of storyline leading up to it. And BJ was just tearing it up in that fight. You know, he landed that huge knee at the end. You know, Sherk was done. You know, that was an awesome fight. I love that fight. This was like overall, like I remember watching this fight live, like with my friends. We ordered the pay-per-view, and it was like one of the best. Like we were all going nuts. The whole night was just action, like the whole like nonstop action. Even now when I watch it, like I have a lot of fun because it's like watching like a best of DVD or something. There's so many good fights on this card, everything in it has like amazing submissions, knockouts, title fight. There's so many good matchups on this fight card, so it's definitely worth watching. Every week I'm going to be bringing you an event, so stay tuned. Thank you guys for joining me, and I'll be doing a post-fight show after UFC Fight Night St. Louis, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, and bye.